Good evening, everybody. I'm Ann Breckenridge Barrett. I'm the director of the Center for Creative Photography and the Associate Vice President for the Arts here at the University of Arizona, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 4th annual Ansel Adams birthday celebration. We're pleased you're here this evening to kick off what's going to be a great weekend. And this year's birthday celebration is particularly special because we are celebrating the release of our Chief Curator's book, Making a Photographer, the Early Work of Ansel Adams. But more on Becky in a minute. First, I'm going to talk about a few upcoming events. Don't miss the Festival of Books, the weekend of March 14th. Becky's going to be reading on the Western National Park stage and signing her book at the CCP tent. We also have our spring lecture series. It begins with Lev Manovich on March 19th, Sama Al-Shabi and Deborah Willis on March 26th. Both of those are going to be fantastic. I want to thank our Director Circle members who are here this evening. If you're a Director Circle member, would you please raise your hand? Their support really makes our increasing programming possible, and we couldn't do it without you, so thank you. Also, thank you to our members. You make up our community, and I just got the numbers this week. We have doubled the size of our membership in the past 2 years. So, yeah, that's pretty phenomenal. If you're not a member, please consider joining us. You'll receive access to special events like tonight, discounts on tickets, and the opportunity to travel with us. We go to Paris, we go to New York. Our Director Circle members have their trips to Carmel, and this year they're going to Santa Fe, so please consider becoming a member at any level that you desire. I'd also want to thank Vice President for the Arts and Dean of the College of Fine Arts, Andy Schultz, for being here tonight and for being just a huge fan of the Center for Creative Photography. Thank you, Andy. And I wouldn't be standing up here tonight if it was not for the incredible colleagues that I have here at the Center for Creative Photography. They worked tirelessly to make this event possible, and their expertise and best practice is shown in the way we do our work every day. So thank you to my colleagues here at the Center. Now, it is my distinct honor to introduce to you Dr. John Schaefer, who is the co-founder with Ansel Adams of the Center for Creative Photography.
Thank you very much, and it's good to see all of you. I unfortunately had a glass of wine when I walked in, and hadn't had much to eat, so I'm not quite as coherent as I usually like to be. I was asked to say a few words about the center and what have you. One of the wonderful things about being the president of a university is that you get to meet a lot of really interesting people. And I go back a fairly long way now. I remember when I first got here, Isaac Bashevis Singer was a fine writer and a visitor to the university, and I was a fan of his writings. I got to know him. And other people over the years, like some faculty members, Gerard Kuiper, the author of the Kuiper Belt, the founder of it, and the citer of the moon landing for America, Bart Bach, an incredible astronomer. We have a wonderful anthropology department, and some extraordinary faculty members there. We had visitors like Yo-Yo Ma and Marcel Marceau, who I got to photograph. All of these people spoke in their own kinds of languages. Singer, obviously, as a writer, we've had poets of note here. Astronomers speak in their own language in terms of the universe and what they care about and think about and pursue. Photographers also have their own language, and photography really is a language. You know, it's the language of our time. People don't commit their thoughts and daily events to diaries anymore, but they all keep their iPhone photographs and perhaps even prints in an album. And photography was the language that Ansel Adams used. I got to know Ansel in the mid-1970s, and he was an extraordinary man, probably the most delightful encounter that I had with people of extraordinary abilities and talents that became ultimately part of this university. We invited Ansel to have a show at the university in the mid-1970s, and it was a 300 print show at the Museum of Art across the way, and it was a fabulous place and a fabulous evening. I met him for the first time at the opening of the show. We had, as I did tonight, a drink before going over to the opening, and as we were walking into the art museum, I said, Ansel, wouldn't you like to give your archives to the University of Arizona? Well, I was young, stupid, and naive at the time, not recognizing that I really had to be courting him for a dozen years with dinners and wine before I popped a question like that. Well, he was a little bit taken aback, and I said, you know, Berkeley thinks they're getting my archives, but they're just going to bury all my photographs and negatives in the basement of the Bancroft Library. If you'd like to think about photography in a broader scale, I'd like to talk to you some more. And he invited me up to his home the next month. We spent a week together talking about photography. Photography was something that I had a personal interest in and really thought about the fact that, no, this is really the history of our time. It's the way we record social events. It records wars on a daily basis. And what would America be without the impact of photography? You had Lewis Hine highlighting the desperate plight of young children, 7, 8, 9 years old, working in woolen cotton mills in the South. You had Jacob Riis photographing immigrants in the Bowery, pricking the conscience of Americans and changing the laws. And Ansel Adams was doing the same thing. He was pointing out wilderness, what it meant to us. He pointed out social problems. He documented, for example, Manzanar, our concentration camp during World War II, where we kept so many Japanese Americans at bay. He photographed people, and he photographed the very special places that make Earth our home that's gradually slipping away from us in so many ways. And so to have his documentation here at the University of Arizona in terms of the archives is something really very special about the University of Arizona. And it's an incredible resource that I hope that you and our students get to be exposed to on a very regular basis. And we have one lucky event taking place tonight. This young lady, Rebecca Senf, actually did a PhD thesis on Ansel Adams. And she will tell you more about Ansel Adams than probably anybody else really knows. But she doesn't have one story in it that I will tell you about Ansel Adams. Ansel Adams is the only really major photographer that I know that never photographed a nude. But we weren't sure about that. I'm a trustee of the Ansel Adams Publishing Rights Trust, and we wanted to do a biography of Ansel Adams. Ansel did an autobiography, and the review of the autobiography was, this is Ansel's life as he would have liked to have lived it. Well, we wanted to do a biography of Ansel Adams' life, and no holds barred. So we got together, we found someone who was going to do the biography, and I was tapped as the person to go down and talk to 90-year-old Virginia Adams to say, Virginia, if this is going to be a really worthwhile biography, it's got to be absolutely honest. There may be things in there that may cause a little bit of embarrassment to the family. She said, oh, John, don't worry about that. Ansel wasn't very interested in sex. Furthermore, he wasn't very good at it. So Becky, top that if you will.
I love that joke. Thank you, Dr. Schaefer. I mentioned earlier what an honor it is to work with my colleagues here at the center. And one of the best parts of my job is the opportunity that I get to be around them, to see their focus, to see their expertise. And I've said it before, a great leader surrounds herself with a group of people who are much smarter and better looking than she is. And here at the CCP, you know, our director of the curatorial division, our chief curator, Dr. Rebecca Senf, is just that person. When I came here 2 years ago, I sat down with Becky and I was assessing the entire center, and we talked about her scholarship, her journey with Ansel Adams, and right away I made a decision to support the writing of this book, in addition to asking her to do numerous other things. To the extent that the center's foray back into publications would be the co-publishing of this book, I'm very, very proud. Let me tell you a little bit about Becky. She began her Adams journey in 2003 at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, where she did an exhibition and a publication. She followed that and continued with her doctoral work and dissertation, completing that in 2007 when she came to the Center for Creative Photography. Since joining in 2007, and when she joined, she was the inaugural Norton Family Curator for the Phoenix Art Museum. We have a partnership with Pam, and Becky took over populating and activating that gallery consistently over 10 years, I believe it was, and really established a tight and ongoing relationship with Phoenix. So our collection was being seen by countless folks in the 5th largest city in the country. During her time here, she's curated over a dozen Ansel Adams exhibitions, and this book represents some of the first new scholarship on Ansel Adams in 20 years. I was honored to write the introduction to this book, and it is my pleasure to introduce the author, Rebecca Senf.
I don't really know how to follow that Dr. Schaefer story. I will do what I can. So, as Annie said, my name is Rebecca Senf. Tonight's talk, the way we're going to work it is I'm going to give you a quick overview of the book. I'm going to read a short passage from the book, and then I'm going to talk about the process of creating the book. So I'm going to go back and talk to you about my research and what that process was like and some of the discoveries that I made. Then I'm going to read another short passage of the book. Then Annie and I are going to get together and do a conversation, and then we will open up for questions to the audience. The way that we'll do questions to the audience is you'll text them to us, and they'll come to Annie on an iPad so that she can ask. And then after that, we'll do a book signing, which will happen here in the auditorium. You can buy books either here at the desk or at the desk in the lobby. All right, here we go. So the book, as Annie mentioned, is co-published between the Center for Creative Photography and Yale University Press, and is a culmination of research I began in 2003. It is the dissertation that I wrote, but then revised for a more general audience and added to it to complement the original content. The main question that the book asks about Ansel Adams's early work is, how does he go from being the artist who creates the work on the left that dates from around 1920 to being the artist who creates the work on the right, which is from 1958. It's called Aspens, Northern New Mexico. In the business, we call this print horizontal aspens to differentiate it from vertical aspens, which was made the same year. And so that's what my book does, is charts a course from these early pictures to his mature work or his signature style. And the way it works is it goes through a series of chapters, each of which is a case study that brings us forward in his progression. So we start with these pictures, which are his childhood album. This is his very first trip to Yosemite in 1916. He was 14 years old in that year. And this album is here at the center. It's part of the Ansel Adams archive. It's also in the exhibition that's opening tonight and on view. And in this album, we can see Ansel Adams making snapshots. He was using a Kodak Box Brownie camera, so not a thing that had any controls. And he created snapshots that were then developed by the commercial photo finisher in the Valley. So they're just little commercial snapshots. But what's interesting is he arranges them in the album with great intention. He organizes them according to the various landforms that he photographed in Yosemite. And you can see here, for instance, this is a group of 5 pictures, all of Half Dome. I'm going to forward to another group. So there's a total of 10 pictures of Half Dome in the album. And even though they're not technically that adept, we can see him beginning to experiment with composition. So you can see the way in which he's moved Half Dome, here it's at the top edge, over here it's at the right, here he's got tents in the foreground, not quite clear what happened here, probably not what he intended, but he's experimenting and thinking about composition and lighting and trying to see what he can accomplish with the camera. So this gives us a starting point, a baseline for Adams as a photographer. The next chapter is about his Parmelian prints of the High Sierras from 1927. This was a portfolio of high mountain pictures that he created with the support of Albert Bender, who is his patron. And this was his first attempt to sell photographs to an audience. He hadn't really thought much about what that audience was, who they were, what they might want. So this is his initial attempt to be a professional art photographer. The next chapter looks at his album for the Sierra Club. He was the official photographer of the Sierra Club outing, which was a 4-week trip to the Canadian Rockies in 1928. And for that album, he compiled together a group of pictures that he made on the trip as a sales piece so that people who went on the trip could select from those images the things that they wanted fine prints of. So here we see him working with an audience that's a little bit more what he's familiar with, because he himself was a Sierra Club member and had a sense of who his fellow Sierra Club members were and the kinds of things they would want. The next chapter of the book focuses on his publication, Taos Pueblo, from 1930. He photographed at that northern New Mexico Pueblo, creating pictures like the one on the left of the Ranchos de Taos Church, which is actually not on the Pueblo, and the people and architecture of the Pueblo itself. The book was tremendously successful. It was sold after the stock market crash in 1929, and yet sold out the entire edition of 108 pictures. And we'll get back to that in just a minute. And then there's a chapter in the book on his commercial work for the Yosemite Park and Curry Company. So this is one of the photographs he made of the ice skating rink in Yosemite. And this chapter, which again we'll talk about more later, has a lot of new information about Ansel. There hasn't been a study of his commercial work before, so this is bringing a new kind of way of looking at his career. All right, so now I need to switch papers here. So one of the things that the book does that hasn't been done before is to distinguish the characteristics of his signature style. So I am sure every one of you sitting in this room knows an Ansel Adams photograph when you see it. And so one of my jobs as an art historian is to identify and articulate what those characteristics are that help us know an Ansel Adams when we see it. And so I'm going to talk about that style. He uses it to heroize the landscape and to emotionally engage us as viewers, to get us invested in his concern about the potential of nature to transform us and give us these unique experiences. So the qualities that he uses are a panoramic perspective of a distant landscape, an omniscient viewpoint, dramatic light and weather effects, a balance of a wide range of gray tones, and he uses these to create drama and to evoke awe. And so what I'm going to do is read a short passage from the book that talks about this. Using the Tetons and the Snake River, which we're seeing here from 1942, as an example, it is possible to describe these stylistic elements that Adams brought together to support his communicative goal. This photograph visually expresses the transformative potential of experiences in nature and the value of wilderness as an intrinsic good. In sum, it presents a heroic vision of the American wilderness as an invaluable asset to its citizens. Adams chose a vantage point that facilitated a panoramic view of the Teton mountain range with the winding Snake River. The picture includes a swath of cloud-filled sky and distant mountains with patches of bright snow. In the mid-range, the silvery river curves through tree-covered banks. With little immediate foreground, Adams created a perspective that suggests his omniscient grasp of the scene, and as such, implies that what is presented is made from the ideal position and is the best, or perhaps the only, way this particular vista should be seen. It is a stylistic choice that imparts authority and gravity to the picture and confers importance on the subject. Adams favored landscape views that featured visible weather, such as snowstorms, billowing clouds, and rain. In some instances, his photographs include a wide band of sky to accommodate clouds, emphasizing an atmospheric expanse. In other cases, clouds and mist appear around landforms, creating depth within the three-dimensional space and helping to define and shape the appearance of the land itself, as with this picture, Clearing Winter Storm. One advantage of weather for Adams was its ephemeral nature. Clouds, rain, and snow are all temporal elements, and they impart a sense of transience and motion to Adams's necessarily still frames. In the Tetons and the Snake River, the sky glows behind dark storm clouds, and the left-hand portion of the mountains is bathed in sunlight, as is the surface of the Snake River, causing it to shimmer within the darker surrounding territory. Because of the changeability of the light and weather depicted, the viewer is aware that the scene Adams captured must not have looked like this for long, and indeed will never look like this exactly again. Thus, the viewer can both appreciate the magical qualities of spectacular clouds and illuminating rays as inspiring features of the natural world, and also attribute to Adams the ability to perceive and record just the right moment when the scene offered this exquisite combination of visual effects. A key component of Adams's mature style is an operatic treatment of his subject, a desire to heighten the dramatic qualities of the scene and create a photographic work of art that is both widely comprehensible and spectacular. In some instances, it is achieved by his use of viewpoint. At other times, it is light or weather effects that can convey that engaging sense of drama. In some pictures, such as the Tetons and the Snake River, It is the use of powerful shifts in contrast, glittering passages of light interspersed with or appearing alongside areas of dense shadow or darkness. Adams' use of heightened contrast gives his images an engaging forcefulness, making his artworks bold and serious. The perception that the landscape is imbued with drama creates an expectation that the situation is not static and that viewers are observing a fleeting moment within an evolving situation. Adams's use of operatic and awe-inspiring qualities in his prints plays upon the expectation of viewers. The Tetons and the Snake River as a work of photographic art is impactful because the actual scene, when observed by a typical national park tourist, does not look like it does in Adams's picture. His complete set of skills in making the negative and the print coalesce to create an artwork that surpasses people's real-life experience, presenting an idealized, heroic version of what really exists, but one still rooted in the appearance of the scene. In so doing, Adams' artworks convey not what he saw, but what he felt. Perhaps more importantly, they convey what Adams hoped his viewers would feel when faced with these landscapes that were deeply meaningful and inspiring to him. So, as Annie mentioned, in 2003, I was hired by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where I had been a graduate student intern, to work on a major Ansel Adams exhibition that was from the Lane collection, which at that time was the largest collection of Adams's work in private hands and was on long-term loan to the museum. It has since been gifted to the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. And so this is Michael and Jeannie Adams. Michael is Ansel's son. This is Sandra Lane, the owner of the works that were on view in the collection. This is Ginny Adams. She is Ansel's granddaughter. Karen Haas, who is the main curator of the exhibition. Ann Adams-Helms, who's Ansel Adams' daughter. And myself, a much younger, earlier version of myself, right there. So at that point, I had already planned another dissertation topic. I'm going to read you the title. American Indian Photographs by Edward Curtis and Frank Rhinehart from Turn-of-the-Century World's Fairs. It was a very dissertation-y topic. But what it was doing was looking at Frank Rhinehart's pictures from the 1898 Omaha World's Fair, and you're seeing one of them here on the left. This is a family group of American Indians who were living in the Indian Congress that was taking place there at the Omaha World's Fair. And then on the right, you're seeing his studio that was on the fairgrounds. And so he would invite the Indians who were living in this encampment to come to his studio to have their portraits made. And then I was going to contrast that with Edward Curtis's work, which was shown in 1907 at the Jamestown World's Fair in the Indian Bureau's exhibition area. And what was fascinating to me was that Adams's pictorialist Indian photographs were being used as documentation and illustration in the World's Fair. So for instance, this picture here we see up here in the display at the World's Fair. So once I was hired for this Ansel Adams exhibition, it didn't make sense that I would spend the next 3 years researching Ansel Adams during the day and then come home and try and research these two photographers at night. So my dissertation advisor, Kim Sichel, agreed that I could change my topic to Ansel Adams. She accepted that we would work out something at a later point, and so I made that change. Truthfully, I'm glad that I did. I was emotionally very attached to these American Indian pictures, and I think it would have been harder to finish. So I'm glad that I made that switch. I decided that I would work on Ansel Adams. I came up with 3 different proposals for her, one of which we settled on about his early work. At that time, I identified the case studies, which are actually the case studies that are presented in my current book. Although my topic at that point was a little different, I thought it was going to be about place and the way that Ansel Adams related to various locales, but that element of it changed. So once I was hired for the Ansel Adams exhibition, I went with Karen Haas, the main curator of the exhibition, seen here in front of the LeConte Lodge in Yosemite National Park, the head of the Sierra Club in the valley. on an 18-day research trip throughout California. We were in Los Angeles, we were in San Francisco, in Yosemite. We went to UC Berkeley and studied at the Bancroft Library, where there are materials that relate to Ansel Adams's participation in the Sierra Club. This is another picture of me on the campus of UC Berkeley. And we were meeting with family members, we were meeting with Ansel Adams's former assistants, and we were going to various archives to consult the materials that were there. This is me photographing Bridal Veil Fall. Karen Haas's husband was a photographer, so he took this picture of me making this photograph and drained the color out of the landscape so it looks like I'm photographing a black and white landscape. It's kind of a fun picture. So our basic research approach was to go to the relevant archives and then look through the finding aids and basically look at all the materials that related to the works that were in the MFA exhibition. And then for my research, I was looking at everything that was related to each of the case studies in my various chapters. This was all pre-iPhone. So the rule at the time, especially here at the Center for Creative Photography, where the Ansel Adams Archive is located, was that any unpublished manuscript was copyright protected. And so you weren't allowed to photocopy it, which meant we had to note or transcribe any material that we thought was interesting. So there was a lot of copying out letters and writings. Late in 2003, I attended a tour that photographer Frank Golke was giving at John Tchaikovsky's Ansel Adams at 100. And this is an installation view of that exhibition at MoMA Queens, where I went to see the show. And Frank Golke, who now teaches here at the University of Arizona, is a Regents professor, was taking us through the exhibition and sharing John Tchaikovsky's thesis about Ansel Adams, which was that his work changed fundamentally around 1940, and John Tchaikovsky felt that Ansel Adams's strongest work was of the 1930s and early 1940s. So he particularly preferred the more modernist works that Adams did before 1940. So as Frank Golke was touring us through the show, and I was listening to this, and I'd already been doing a fair amount of research, I had this epiphany. Ansel Adams's work changed around 1940. Another thing, a really important thing, happened around 1940. He was hired by the federal government in 41 to do a project photographing the national parks to create murals for the Department of Interior building. And it felt like that was probably related. There was something in making those pictures for the American people that changed the way he thought about photography. So that was my hypothesis as I went into the main part of my research. So what I'm going to do now is talk about some of these discoveries that I made in the course of my research. And I'm going to go through sort of by category of material that I looked at. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about is journals. Now, Ansel Adams didn't keep a journal, and I think many researchers would tell you that journals are like the gold standard of research. If you have somebody writing to themselves about what they were thinking, that's just the best. We don't have that for Ansel Adams. But Joseph N. LeConte did keep a journal, and he and Ansel Adams did camping trips together. So this gave me access to some firsthand accounts of what these camping trips were like. And so this is actually from 1903. The journal that I read was from 1925 because that's when Ansel was traveling with LeConte. And I'm going to show you this picture as I tell you a little bit about the journals. Each day LeConte would write about 4 lines and he would summarize that day. And he would talk about things like the food or the weather or their activities or the quality of the trail or the wildlife they encountered or the people that they met. And so he would describe things like eating a, quote, wonderful pan of biscuits on return to camp, or, quote, a tremendous rainstorm that swept the head of Bubbs Creek and the most magnificent rainbow I have ever seen spanning the West Fayette, end quote. And then he'd talk about activities like fishing, swimming, tramping, writing letters, and botanizing. So the 1925 journal in particular makes several mentions of times when Adams was off photographing, including one from July 6th where he says, The three were off again for Kearsarge this cold, clear morning at 7. I simply loafed about and killed time till Helen and Joseph returned at 1. Those were his children. A perfect day, clear as a bell. Ansel stayed on past to get proper lighting effects, end quote. So in 1925, when Adams was on this extended trip with Joseph LeConte and his children, Helen and Joseph, there's an entry that reads, quote, got up late, and after a good breakfast, I went around on the west side of the lake and found a beautiful white granite rock bedded in the meadow grass near the shore of the lake. At the foot of this, Helen, Joseph, and I buried the box containing the ashes of my beloved wife. I then drilled the rock and started work on the placing of the bronze tablet. In the afternoon, I finished the erection of the tablet and with Ansel's help, placed a flat boulder over the grave, end quote. And so this is one of Ansel Adams's pictures of Marion Lake, where LeConte's wife's ashes were buried, that he made on this trip when he was with them. Another category of material that's very valuable are photographs. And so we think about portraits of Ansel Adams and what they tell us. And as I was learning about his life as a mountaineer, I kept thinking about pictures like this, which imply that he was driving up to every scene that he photographed. But then I came across earlier portraits of Adams. So this one, which is included in the book, which is made by Francis Farquhar, of Ansel as a skinny young man with his Sierra Club cup on his belt out in the wilderness, gave me such a better sense of who this young mountaineer was. Or pictures like these with him with his burro, and you can see all the camera equipment that's here. He's working with glass plate negatives in this era, so they were heavy and bulky, and so it was impossible for him to carry all that himself. Or the picture that's on the right where we see his backpack, the camera up on the tripod. Here's a case for camera equipment, and he's seated there. I'm not sure, it doesn't look like he's reading a map, so I'm not sure exactly what it is that he's reading there, but these all gave me such a more visceral sense of this young mountaineer that I was learning about and writing about and wanting to share with people. Because he was so famous in his later years, people know that later Ansel, and I wanted to introduce them to this younger Ansel. Another photograph that was really helpful was finding this picture of a window display at the Yosemite National Park Museum. This is part of his commercial work that he did for Yosemite Park and Curry Company. And I had been reading in the correspondence that they created these window displays, but I don't know, I didn't know what a window display was. And then I came across this photograph in the file, and it was like, oh, that's what a window display is. Now I understand what it is. And this photograph in the background, and in fact, all of the photographs in this scene are made by Ansel Adams, but I was able to be sure because I could find them printed in other places and verify that they were by Adams. So here he was providing illustrations for these opportunities to sell both, in this case, skiing and snowshoeing gear, and then encourage people to come visit Yosemite National Park. So the next major category of material that we use as researchers is correspondence. And one of the first things that I found that really made a huge difference in solidifying my thinking about this hypothesis that I had was a quote that Ansel Adams wrote in a letter to David McAlpin, who was a friend of his and a trustee at the Museum of Modern Art. And what I've done is I've pulled it out here on the right, but I'm going to read it to you. He says, "Well, have much to discuss with you on photography in general. Seem to have a rather strong opinion formulating itself within on the functions of photography and the impact on society. I am becoming increasingly wary of the effete aspects and more appreciative of the deep need now for health and strength and clarity and consideration for the response of people, not just esoteric response from a select few who comprehend remote symbolisms," end quote. So he's saying to McAlpin that he's more concerned with a clear message to a group of people than to impressing a few art elites. And this was written in 1947, but I think that this embodies what he had been trying to do since he started the National Parks Project, which is think about an American public audience for his work and how to reach those people. One of the great things about Ansel Adams is he was a really proficient correspondent, and so if he thought it, he probably wrote it at some point, and then it's just a matter of going through enough of the correspondence to find it. That's not true with everyone. We have plenty of archives where there is not a scrap of information that tells you what the photographer was thinking. But with Ansel Adams, we get lots of written material, which is great. For instance, as I was working on the Taos Pueblo book, I found wonderful correspondence that gave me a sense of the nitty-gritty back and forth as they were planning the book, figuring out how much to pay Mary Austin, who was the writer for the book, figuring out what they would charge. And so, for instance, this pair of letters, on the left, we see Ansel Adams writing to Mary Austin, and he's writing about the price, how to price the book. He writes, "I have been carefully weighing in my mind the number of copies to be made and the price to charge. The practical phase of the venture is too serious to be secondary. Were I to be stuck and take in less than the book cost, it would be rather disastrous to our affairs. Here is the comparative specifications on the two propositions regarding the book. 1, 250 copies at $50 apiece will require the sale of 90 copies to meet the material cost of the edition. 2, 100 copies at $75 apiece will require the sale of 45 copies to meet the material cost of the edition." Now we see in the letter on the right-hand side, Mary Austin is writing back, and she says, quote, "250 copies of a book at $50 a copy seems to me to be beyond belief, and 100 copies at $75 a copy leaves me gasping," end quote. Adams actually recommends that the latter might be the safer course of action, and that's what they ultimately did. They decided to make 100 copies at the incredible price of $75 each, which in today's dollars is about $1,100. And again, they sold out an edition of 108 books months after the stock market crash. So Adams really nailed it when he was working on this particular publication. The correspondence did have some surprising gaps. As I read this group of letters between Adams and Austin, I was sure that I was going to find Ansel Adams talking about his relationship or his feelings about the Taos Pueblo Indians that he was photographing, and it wasn't anywhere. I mean, dozens of letters back and forth. And here he is writing to an American Indian activist, so I really thought he would talk about that, and he didn't. So then, as an art historian, I did what art historians do, which is I used the pictures to interpret how I felt that Adams was reacting and responding to the American Indians that he was photographing. The correspondence also had some unpleasant surprises. So one day I was sitting in my graduate student carrel at Mugar Library at Boston University. This is a picture of it. We affectionately called them the cages because, as you can see, it was a lockable chain link box that was against the windows at the backside of the library. And I was reading about the book 4 Seasons in Yosemite National Park, which was the subject of my chapter on the Yosemite Park and Curry Company commercial work. And I was reading this letter, which was one that I did actually photocopy. It was from the Yosemite National Park Museum. So I was sitting there reading this folder of material that I hadn't seen, just photocopied when I was there. And I read, quote, "In addition, several of the pictures are not mine, and they are rather bad photographs, and yet my name appears on the title page, making me responsible for all the pictures in the book as they appear," end quote. This is Ansel Adams writing to Don Tresidor. I think I swore out loud. I was using this book as my case study, and suddenly I'm learning that not all the pictures are by Ansel Adams, which means I can't use them as an example or evidence if they're not by him. So that necessitated an emergency return trip to Yosemite National Park from Boston, which I did. This is me and my toddler son, Nick. He's now turning 15. But what I did is, in these early years when I had a small child, my mom was a research professor here at the University of Arizona, and so when I would have a trip, she would meet me there. She would take care of Nick while I researched during the day, and then we would all have dinner together at night. So this is me and Nick sitting in the Merced River in Yosemite Park during that emergency research trip, where I was able to go back and basically at the Yosemite National Park Museum go through his files and figure out which of the pictures in the book I could confirm were his, and then I was able to use those pictures for the study. And then there were other kinds of documents that I used as well. This is Ansel Adams's cash log from 1934. It's part of the archive here at the center. And on the left-hand side are the incoming amounts of money, and on the left are his expenditures. This is in Virginia Adams' hand, his wife. And so it's a tracking of all of his money. And it was really valuable for the Yosemite Park and Curry Company chapter because I was able to prove how important that particular job was. More than half of his income in this year came from that one job, and it was enough money to cover his entire mortgage payment for that year. So it was helpful in demonstrating its significance to him. So that's about the research. After all the research and writing was done, I submitted my dissertation in 2007. You can see a copy of it here. And then over the next 10-year period, I worked on finding a publisher. I did some revisions of a few chapters in that process. But the process of really transforming it into a book started in earnest in 2018 after Annie arrived here at the center, and the center came on as a co-publisher to the book. I added 2 chapters, a new introduction and a concluding chapter about his work in the national parks, which required new research in the archive. And I was really surprised as I researched about the national parks work that there was information in the archive that had never been published, which was surprising to me because his national parks work is some of the most published of his photography. There were lots of rounds of proofreading. This is me and my cat Sammy on my bed at home working through reading the book. I actually read the entire book aloud, looking for errors in the way the sentences read. But if you find a mistake in the book, feel free to let me know. I want to know about anything so that we can correct it if we get another edition. But we did what we could to make sure it was accurate. It was interesting how long errors persisted. Part of the problem is that until I thank you out there, I'm getting nodding heads. So I appreciate that from those of you who have been through this process before. One of the tricks is that the images aren't with the text for a long part of the process, and so when you finally get the pictures back with the text, you start to catch things that have been wrong. So for instance, here's my text on the left-hand side. I had been saying that in this brochure, which we're seeing on the right, that there was a young woman on skis. Well, she's not on skis, she's holding skis. Well, it's an important difference. So it was good once I finally had the designed version with the pictures that I could catch those kinds of mistakes. But as I said, if there are more, let me know. So once I was finally finished, I began to feel that the chapter on the Yosemite Park and Curry Company was the most important and interesting. Having a little distance on the book, just having it finished, allowed me to begin to think more objectively about it and to evaluate it in a different way. And I could begin to appreciate that that was the material that added the most content to our scholarship and understanding. And that's why it's one of the focuses in the Signature Style show that's on view here in the galleries. So for instance, this is a wall of Adams's commercial work, tiny sampling of the commercial work of his that we have in the Ansel Adams archive, but a way to show you the kinds of things that we have in the collection and the kinds of projects that he did. He was never shy or apologetic about his commercial work and did actually write about it in his autobiography, but he never really reflected on how it impacted his artistic work. I think he saw it primarily as financially supporting him and allowing him to do his artistic work. But I think that there are really important elements of his signature style that are influenced by especially the work for the Yosemite Park and Curry Company. There's been no in-depth study on that commercial work until now, so It's in part because many of his early biographers were people who knew him and worked with him late in life. He didn't think it was important, so he directed people towards other things, and that's what they tended to write about. But as a scholar, I went back to the original source material, and it seemed very important. The YPCCO, the Yosemite Park and Curry Company, was especially important because of his long duration. He worked with them for 8 years, and the range of ways that he worked with them. So, for instance, he did this book, which I mentioned earlier, 4 Seasons in Yosemite National Park. This is unequivocally one of his pictures of golfing in Yosemite National Park. So this was one of the outlets. Another was, how many of you have been to the Ahwahnee in Yosemite National Park? Oh, good, good. I would say maybe a quarter of you. So it used to be that each day, for each meal at the Ahwahnee, they would print a new menu, which was a souvenir that you could take home, and it had an Ansel Adams image on the cover. You can buy these on eBay. They're still kicking around. And so here's his image on the cover, and then on the inside it would talk about the image, and then, you know, this is breakfast, the breakfast menu, so you can have grapefruit juice or tomato juice or orange juice or prune juice. And so you can see all of your options on your menu and then take it home as a souvenir. And then he also did a series of postcards. And these postcards he sold at Best Studio in the park and helped promote Yosemite, all kinds of things included in those postcards, which is in part the reason that we included it on the cover of the book. So here's this El Capitan postcard, and on the book, made to look like it's tipped on to the cover of the book. And as I said, I think it's one of the important parts that I have added to the scholarship. Okay, I'm going to read you one last passage from the book. By far, Adams's most famous photograph is Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico. Oft told, the story of its making is one of photographic legend. The creation of the Moonrise negative happened on a trip when he was accompanied by his son Michael and his friend Cedric Wright, and that's what we're seeing here. Ansel's standing all the way to the right, Cedric Wright in the middle, and Michael sitting on the left. They had been making photographs without much success in the Chama River Valley near Georgia O'Keeffe's Ghost Ranch in northern New Mexico. Driving back to Santa Fe, Adams hastily responded to what he saw before him. Quote, "In the east, the moon was rising over distant clouds and snow peaks. In the west, the late afternoon sun glanced over a south-flowing cloud bank and blazed a brilliant white upon the crosses in the church cemetery." End quote. With the sun setting, he knew he had to act fast. Swerving his station wagon to the side of the road, he commanded his son and Wright to help him set up his 8x10-inch view camera. Tripod, camera body, lens board, lens, dark cloth, loaded film holder, and light meter had to be pulled out and assembled before he could frame and focus the view, made all the more urgent by the rapid descent of the November sun. In the frantic hustle, the light meter could not be found. Evaluating the scene before him, Adams miraculously remembered the luminance of the full moon, 250 candles per square foot, and was able to approximate an exposure for the scene. He released the shutter and captured the clouds, moon, and mountains beyond the little town of Hernandez. Before he could make a second backup negative, the sun dipped below the horizon and the opportunity was gone. With that single negative, Adams preserved a view that has become a photographic icon. The image at its core exhibits many of his mature stylistic elements. Adams filled the frame with a vast expanse of sky, the moon hovering above a bank of horizontally striated clouds and a long, low chain of mountains. He placed the chapel and cross-filled graveyard of Hernandez in the middle ground, bounded by a shrub-filled plain. The picture features a panoramic sweep of landscape and compellingly asserts that this perspective, with its precise arrangement of human edifice within a monumental and impressive environment, is the critical viewpoint for observing the scene. The drama comes in part from the relative scale of the elements. The endless quality of the sky reminds viewers of how small and seemingly insignificant we are in the expanse of the universe. All of these visual qualities serve to inspire in the viewer a sense of awe in the face of a spectacular and unique visual experience, an appreciation for the natural scene, and a feeling of amazement. Unlike the mountain pictures of the late 1920s and 1930s found in his Parmelian Prints portfolio or his Sierra Club album, Moonrise clearly conveys Adams's intensity of experience, his message about the transcendental possibilities for people when they are immersed in nature, and his deep appreciation for the American landscape. Comparing the final print to his proof print powerfully demonstrates the visualization he described experiencing when he made his monolith, The Face of Half Dome, negative in 1927. The proof print is a straight or unaltered printing from the negative with no darkroom work, such as dodging or burning, that allows the manipulation of exposure to select areas of a print. As such, it affords a view of Hernandez that is much closer to the one Adams originally observed, albeit in black and white. From this view of the landscape, he envisioned, or to use his parlance, visualized, the finished artwork of Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico. Moonrise existed only in his imagination. He photographed a raw scene that he could transform in the darkroom into a symbol that would convey how he felt under a vast and beautiful New Mexico sky. By altering the relationship of the sky in the graveyard of the Hernandez Chapel to create a dark expanse over a shimmering village burial ground, Adams created from the raw material of the landscape an emotionally engaging image, one that borders on magic or mysticism. On that November day, Adams drew on more than 2 decades of wilderness exploration and photographic experience to create what would become his masterpiece. Deep and repeated contemplation had etched in him the value and meaning of immersing oneself in nature. Equally ingrained were lessons about making photographs that effectively convey an essential idea. Adams's early years had readied him for the scene he discovered along the highway as the sun set over northern New Mexico. Thank you.
There are questions already. Okay. All right. Becky, Ansel Adams was a California native, but his archive is here in Tucson. So could you tell us something about his ongoing connection to the American Southwest?
So the book that Ansel Adams did in 1930 of the Taos Pueblo Indians followed a series of years of traveling to northern New Mexico. And when he first went in 1927, he was a little shocked by how little photography was being done in northern New Mexico. And compared to the glut of photographers that he knew in California, it felt like northern New Mexico was really wide open for a photographer like himself to make a living. So he was really excited about the prospect of working in northern New Mexico. He loved the American Southwest. It was a really significant place for him, and he loved Tucson.
He photographed here.
He photographed
the White
here.
Dove of the Desert, correct?
He did at Santa Fe Mission.
Mm-hmm.
He in the 1950s he was wanted to do more photography in Arizona, so he wrote to Raymond Carlson, who was the editor of Arizona Highways, and basically just said, "I'd like to come and do some photography in Arizona. Don't you think you'd like to have an article by me in Arizona Highways magazine?" And it's so sweet because Raymond Carlson writes back and says, never have I been so proud as the opportunities when we've been able to have the name Ansel Adams grace our pages. We would love to have you do some articles. So he came to, and he loved Death Valley. He really liked the desert Southwest. And so it was an important place for him over many years. And so I think it's nice that his archive is here in Tucson. Even though certainly California would have been a logical place, I think that this is a very comfortable home for him.
How do you think Ansel Adams would feel about the role of photography in the present moment, from digital photography to photography on social media?
Dr. Schaefer, what do you think? I think he would have loved digital photography.
Yeah, and one of my later conversations with him, we talked about that. He thought that digital photography and video was really something extraordinary, and that he said if he were starting out as a photographer in the mid-1970s, he would have probably gone that route.
Huh. Yeah. Ansel Adams had an early word, he had typewriters. We have 3 of his typewriters in the Ansel Adams archive, some of my favorite archive objects. He would travel with typewriters. He was such a compulsive correspondent and wrote so many letters and postcards. And I have to imagine that if Ansel Adams were living today, he would have an iPhone and he'd be tweeting and posting to Instagram and making pictures and sharing pictures and communicating. He was a communicator. It really meant a lot to him to make a connection. And so I just think he would be thrilled and really embrace those opportunities.
Okay, following up on that, what do you think he would photograph today and why?
I mean, in listening to Dr. Schaefer's introduction and thinking about how frightening it feels in this moment, given the situation of the world and the situation of the environment, I can't imagine him not doubling down on
the wilderness.
landscape. I mean, I just think it would have been so important to him to use that channel that he had to help us understand what we were risking and the importance of wilderness, even if we don't go there. It's essential that we have it. And so I think that would have continued to have been important to him. Now, I also think there would have been selfies. And I mean, if you have an iPhone, you take pictures of all the things, but.
Now, you talked about his role as a landscape photographer, but you didn't talk too much about his role in the Sierra Club. I mean, he was quite an advocate in addition to being a photographer, correct?
Right. So he was an activist. He worked politically. His photographs were a part of that activism, but you're right, that was not all that he did. So he used his fame in his later years to meet with presidents and to advocate for greater preservation of wilderness lands. So I think it was for him a life of activism that integrated both his photography and other opportunities.
Right. Okay.
Wait, Dr. Schaefer has something to say.
Just a few more comments.
We need a chair for you.
Manzanar was an important book for him, and it's an incredible documentation of the Japanese concentration camp in California. He felt very strongly about that, and he got a lot of static for doing that, almost being accused of being anti-American for supporting this. I think he would have been very much concerned about immigration issues as they occur today, and would have documented that. He was very politically active, very liberal. I remember him talking about his visit with Ronald Reagan in the White House. Reagan called him in. They sat down together for about 15 to 20 minutes, and came out. We asked him what his impression was. He said it was like turning on a fan in a vacuum.
Hi. Dr. Senf, do you have a favorite Ansel Adams photograph? If so, why is it your favorite?
You know, curators get asked these questions, and it's like trying to choose your favorite child. In the show that's up here, there's a picture in the corner of Royal Arches. It's from 1940, and it's in a comparison with a little bitty picture from 1920. And I'm just in love with it right now. It's got this incredible crispy contrast to it, It's Adams in his transition from this earlier style into his signature style. He's not all the way there yet. It's a more modernist composition. It's horizonless. And so it plays more with the 2D, 3D pressure that you get in great photographs. And it's muscular and strong and emphatic and detailed and rich. I'm just in love with that one right now.
Don't you love how she describes a photograph? Isn't it just amazing?
Thank you. But I mean, the great thing about the Ansel Adams archive is there's so much incredible material that each new print viewing we curate or new exhibition we curate, there's a new thing to fall in love with. And what's great about my job is that then I get to share those things with you all, and then you can come and pick which one is your favorite.
Can you tell us about how the National Parks Commission came about?
So, yes, I can. Ansel Adams had been communicating with Harold Ickes, who was the Secretary of Interior for quite a number of years, around the desire to make a new national park for the Kings Canyon area in California, where he had done a lot of camping and hiking, and it was not yet protected. And so the Sierra Club was lobbying Congress to have this new park made. And so Adams was in communication with Harold Ickes around that. He had created a 3-part folding screen. Have any of you ever seen these big Ansel Adams screens? We have one here at the center, and they go on exhibition on rare occasions. But he had made one of these screens for an exhibition at the Catherine Koo Gallery in Chicago, and then sent it to Ickes afterwards. And it's a little unclear whether Ickes bought it or Adams sent it as a gift, but it was in Harold Ickes' office, and there's a picture of that in my book. So Harold Ickes knew Ansel Adams, and they were in pretty regular communication. And so when the Department of Interior created this mural project to fill the Department of Interior building with art, it was mostly paintings, but they had the idea to include a photographer as well. And so they invited Ansel Adams to create, I think the invitation was something like 1 or more photographs of the national parks. But Ansel Adams got this invitation and was thrilled. I mean, this was the job of a lifetime for Ansel Adams. It was about the parks, which he cared about. It was for mural scale prints, which he actually had experience doing from the mid-1930s when he worked for Yosemite Park and Curry Company. It was for a federal government building for lobbyists and members of the government, but by extension for the American people. And it was just, it all came together for him. It was just the perfect set of circumstances for him at that time.
And that ties into what you said about him really contemplating making pictures for the American public, right? Okay, we have one last one, I'm being told. It's great when an iPad tells you what to do. Annie, in red. Okay, I have to pick from 3 here. They're all good. Okay. How did you select the title of the book, and what is its meaning?
So the book is called Making a Photographer, the Early Work of Ansel Adams. And in 1935, Ansel Adams wrote a technical manual called Making a Photograph. And his point was, you don't take a photograph, you make a photograph. And it's a affirmative, constructive, creative action to make a photograph. And so one day when I was working on one of my proposals for the book, I was standing at my desk typing along, and suddenly it occurred to me that just the way he talked about how you should make a photograph, my book describes how he made himself into a photographer. And so I love the synergy, the alignment between his book title and this title, and then it describes the course of his learning to become the photographer that we know, and fills us in on all those details of how he made himself into a photographer.
Fantastic. Well, I want to let you all know that this is the first stop on a national book tour. Becky's going to be talking at Yosemite, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in New York. And we're just so fortunate to have you here. So thank you and bravo.
Thank you, Annie.
As Brian indicated earlier, we're going to set up the table here, and Becky will be here to sign your books. So, and then we have food, and we can continue drinking and eating outside as well. Okay, thank you for coming.